I think we're about ready to begin. Welcome to the third and final episode of our speaker series for this year. On behalf of St. Patrick's Parish in Falmouth, Our Lady of Victory in Centerville, Our Lady of the Assumption in Osterville, and Christ the King, we're happy to have sponsored this, and I think we'll be doing it again next year. Even though I'm the only surviving pastor of the original group. I'm not sure what that tells me. Just to let you know, copies of Mark Shriver's book, A Good Man, on his father are available at the table here, staffed by the Market Street, I think, bookstore. Market Street bookstore. And all the proceeds that are sold tonight go to Special Olympics.
Oh, very nice.
So we're happy to welcome Mark Shriver. You've all seen his bio. He's going to be talking to us tonight on faith, hope, and love in action, which is a reflection on his father, Sargent Shriver, and his remarkable life. We welcome him.
Thank you. Good afternoon, good evening. Hello, good evening. Okay. Thank you very much, Father Hoy. I appreciate that kind introduction. I'm hoping that after I'm finished tonight, I don't knock you out of being pastor here as well. I'd hate to have that on my record. And thank you all very much for braving the elements. I was actually over with my brother and sister in Nantucket today. And I came over early to make sure I was here on time. They're stuck in Nantucket and taking the 9 o'clock ferry back because the thunderstorms went through there. So I'm here, and I'm happy to be here. I bumped into somebody. It's nice to be in Massachusetts. I went to Holy Cross College, and loved it, and grew up in Maryland. I ran into someone on the way in here, and they looked at me and they said, "Are you speaking tonight?" And I said, "Yeah." And they said, I thought Maria Shriver was speaking tonight." And I said, no, it's Mark Shriver. Nice to meet you. So if you're here for Maria Shriver, I'm sorry. I was actually on the Andrea Mitchell show yesterday talking. I work for Save the Children. I'm talking about the Ebola outbreak in Western Africa, and Save the Children's work with trying to save the lives of babies and mothers across the world. 18,000 of them whom die every day before the age of 5, and 800 mothers die every day in the childbirth process. And anyways, I was on the Andrea Mitchell show, and I walked in, you know, they put hair and makeup on before you go on TV. So I walked into the hair and makeup, and the lady looks at me and goes, "On my sheet it says Maria Shriver. Are you sure you're..." I'm like, what is going on here? And I said, "No, I talked to Andrea Mitchell. She knows it's Mark Shriver." So I feel really good to be here right now. And Maria was going to come, and I'm kind of wanted to stick it to her a little bit, but she's not here. I'll tell you one more funny story. So I was invited to go down to speak in Houston at the Barbara Bush Institute, and I was really honored to be asked to go down there. Mrs. Bush created this family literacy program, which funds programs all across the country for family literacy, which is a wonderful thing. And they have speakers come down, authors who read from their book or tell a few stories from their book. So it was John Meacham, who has won the Pulitzer Prize for his book. I think it was on Jefferson. He's written a couple of them that have done huge #1 bestsellers. A guy named Brad Thor, who's a bestseller, suspense writer. And then a woman named Mary Neal, who's also #1 on the book, #1 on the New York Times. And then there was me. And we had a little lunch with President Bush and Mrs. Bush, all the Bush family members. And you know, one of the Neil Bush got up and toasted each of the authors and then said, "You know, Mark, we're really happy you're here. We really are happy you're here." And Mrs. Bush, Barbara Bush, puts her hands up and goes, "Tell him the truth. We only invited him because he's a Democrat and we needed a Democrat." I said, "Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Bush. That makes me feel very welcome." So I go back anyways to the hotel, and I'm still feeling pretty good, right? There's going to be 2,500 Texans there, and I get into the elevator, and a guy's got a big cowboy hat on. He's got the big, cowboy boots, and he looks right at me as the elevator doors close, and he goes, "Has anyone ever told you you look like a Kennedy?" And I said, "Well, yeah, sometimes." And he goes, "That must make you so mad." So it's nice to be in Massachusetts. Nice to be back with people. People know what Holy Cross is, and they actually clap, so I love it. As I went there, as I said, I loved it. It's the best school in the country. And for those of you who have relatives who went to Boston College, I'm sorry about that. But the woman in the back is waving. Put your hand down, okay? So, Father, I want to thank you again for extending the offer. My good friend, Father Mark Hessian, over at Our Lady of Victory, had written me a note in the summertime, and I saw Kathy, who worked over there for a number of years, who's also a good pal. And he's a wonderful guy, and I'm honored to be here to share a few thoughts. I saw the list last summer of the speakers, this summer of the speakers, and like the Bush experience, there's one of these is not like the other. Everyone was #1 author, selling author, and then there's Mark Shriver. You've got some great speakers this summer, and then there's Mark Shriver. So I am not an author by trade. I worked for Save the Children before that. I was in the Maryland legislature before that. I created a program that works with juvenile delinquent kids. And I wrote this book on my dad, and I know obviously that's why I'm here this evening. And I'll just tell you a couple stories about why I wrote it, and then I hope we'll have a little conversation, ask some questions, and then I was told by Mary that there'd be some snacks here, and I assume there's going to be some. That's why you all came. So I wrote the book on my dad. My mom had died 18 months earlier, and then my Uncle Teddy died 2 weeks after my mom. And then Dad died 18 months after that. We actually had the funeral mass at St. Francis Assisi in Hyannis, and the wake was at Our Lady of Victory over in Centerville. And then when Dad died, I, kind of like, what do I do? And my brother said, why don't you just start writing stories about Dad? It helps in the process of, when people die, your father and your mother die. So I started writing, and when I reflected on his life, I was really struck not by the stories after he died in the newspapers, in the television, saying that he was a great man for having created the Peace Corps out of nothing, for having created Lyndon Johnson's War on Poverty, programs like Head Start, Legal Services for the Poor, Job Corps, VISTA, foster grandparents, all of these programs that are still around 50 years later, or that he took Special Olympics with my mom and spread it all over the world. And I'm so honored that, is it the Market Street bookstore, is dedicating the proceeds tonight to Special Olympics. That is, it's really kind of a Massachusetts thing, You raise money, you give it away. It's a beautiful thing. So it's, and I mean that, it's a cultural thing here where people laugh a lot and then they work like crazy to help others. So I started writing these stories, and I was not touched by the so-called greats, accolades that he got, or the fact that Vice President Biden eulogized him, President Clinton eulogized him, Oprah was there, Stevie Wonder sang, Bono, the lead singer for U2, sang. What really struck me as his son were the stories of a couple of people, the 2 waitresses from his favorite restaurant who waited in line at the wake and said, we served your father, almost simultaneous, we served your father for over 30 years at lunch. He was a good man. And they turned around and walked out of the church. The guy at the U.S. Air counter at National Airport who waited in line at the wake and said, I took your father through security when he was battling Alzheimer's. He was such a good man. And that guy, Edwin DeBus, walked out of the church. The guy who picks up trash in our neighborhood, Calvin Dove, who I saw the other day, parked his trash truck in front of our little driveway, and 2 of our kids and I were out in the front yard, kind of hanging out. And he walked up the little driveway, wiped his hands on his jacket and said, your father was a good man. shook hands, and turned around and walked back, got in his truck, and drove out of the neighborhood. And at first I thought these stories were all, you know, things that people said to you when your father died and your mother had died 18 months earlier. But I realized through the repetition of them that they meant something different. And you know, in Washington, and I know it's true here in Massachusetts as well, there are so-called, you know, great people that when they're not on stage aren't as good to the person who's going to clean up this room as they are to the pastor. Or they're not as good to the guy who works at the airport as they are to the President of the United States. And my pop treated people, whether they were the president or the cardinal who said the funeral mass, or the waitress, or the guy at the US Air counter, or the guy who picks up trash. He treated them all the same. And I realized that at that stage of my life, at whatever I was, 44, 45, with 3 kids, that I needed to figure out how he was good, which is oftentimes more important than being great, and oftentimes gets overlooked, I think, in our culture, and I think it's more important. And I realized that here was a guy that was happily married for 56 years to the woman of his dreams, who raised 5 kids, all of whom love him, who went to Mass every day of his life, and I mean every day of his life. I remember checking into hotels all across America, all across the world, and the first question Dad would ask is, where's the local Catholic church and what's the Mass schedule? And then he would go. Here was a guy that treated presidents the same as he treated secretaries and was fired up and joyful every day. And I needed some of that joy. So that's what the book is about. It's not about growing up as a Kennedy. It's none of that kind of BS. It's really about, it's about a son trying to figure out how his father was joyful. It's a father-son story. So I sat down and started writing stories. And I went back and read. My father used to, hi, oh, there's my friend Jimmy Shea, just walks in 15 minutes late and starts waving in the back. It's nice, right? I mean, everybody else was on time and you're late, okay? So distracting to walk in like that. And his wife, Monica, and kids, all of whom are nicer than Jimmy. So it's nice of you to come. I hope you buy a lot of books, because the proceeds are going to Special Olympics. Okay, so anyways. So I went back and started reading the letters that he wrote. And he would write letters really every day when I was in high school, get them multiple times when I was at Holy Cross, and I got them right up until the point where Alzheimer's rendered him unable to write. And it could be about the Baltimore Orioles, his beloved team, and how they were beating the Red Sox. It could be about you know, a book he read on Mother Teresa, or something he had read in Time magazine about Elie Wiesel. It could be about the conversation we had at dinner, or somebody he met at lunch on the street. And I read those notes, some of which, honestly, he got so many of them, you know, in college, and afterwards I'd be like, oh my God, he's crazy, and I'd stick them in a little file and never open the letters, just because he wrote and wrote. And they were, you know, really beautiful. And then I went back and read the speeches that he had given throughout his life, many of which I'd never taken the time to read because, you know, he's my father and I'll read them later. And I distilled down the 3 messages that defined his life, the 3 virtues that defined his life. And it was his faith in God. And it was a faith that demanded acts of hope and acts of love. And you see this faith, as I mentioned, obviously in the daily Mass. My father, just to contextualize him for a minute, was born in 1915. His grandfather took Jeb Stuart to the Battle of Gettysburg. That guy was a 16-year-old kid, and he took Jeb Stuart in western Maryland up into Pennsylvania, 6 miles away, for the Battle of Gettysburg. And the Shrivers fought on both the North and the South in the Civil War. And that gentleman, Thomas Shriver, went into the priesthood not once but twice after the Civil War, dropped out both times because he got sick, but became great friends with a guy named James Gibbons. And those of you who know Catholic history know that he was the 2nd cardinal in America. And Cardinal Gibbons was my dad's godfather. So you see this commitment to Catholicism, and his parents worked in soup kitchens in Baltimore. Then the family moved up in the summer of 1929 to New York to my grandfather to start a bank. And of course the timing was horrible. Family lost what money they had in the Depression. And my father worked himself through Canterbury, which is a Catholic high school in Connecticut, through Yale and through Yale Law School, because the family was broke. And in the letters, he talked about how his faith sustained him through those trying times and how it sustained his family and kept them together. You see that faith in letters that he wrote about how he survived brutal battle in the Battle of Guadalcanal and Santa Cruz during World War II. Dad graduated from Yale Law School and the next day enrolled in the Navy before Pearl Harbor, and then survived those battles in the South Pacific. And he wrote about how he prayed to God to survive while his shipmates were literally blown to pieces beside him. And then after the war, he came back, went to work for Joe Kennedy at the Merchandise Mart in Chicago, and became involved in the Catholic Interracial Council in Chicago, where he worked with Cardinal Strick to desegregate the Catholic high schools and the Catholic hospitals, and became very good friends with Martin Luther King. And then, I'll tell you one quick story. In the 1960 election, Senator Kennedy, his brother-in-law, put Dad in charge of the civil rights unit of the Kennedy campaign because he knew King and he had been involved in a lot of civil rights work in the 50s. And a couple weeks before that election, the 1960 election, Dr. King was arrested. And a lot of people thought he was going to be killed in a Georgia jail. And the idea came up from the Civil Rights Division that Senator Kennedy could call Coretta Scott King and just express his concern for her and her husband. And the campaign said absolutely not. That the campaign had been told at the beginning of that election that if Kennedy said anything positive about Khrushchev, Castro, or King, the Southern governors in particular would throw their support to Richard Nixon. But Daddy persevered, and it's a great story. A couple days later, in a hotel room in Chicago, waited in the room, everybody cleared out. The last guy, Kenny O'Donnell, went to the bathroom, and Dad said, "Hey, Jack, would you call Coretta Scott King?" And he said, "Well, sure, I'll call her, but I don't have her number." Pulls out the number, dials it. They have less than a minute conversation. Kenny O'Donnell comes out of the bathroom and said, "What's going on?" And all hell breaks loose. Civil rights unit is closed down. Essentially, everyone's fired at that point. But a couple days later, Daddy King, who was a Republican, who had already endorsed Richard Nixon for president, came out and changed his endorsement and said that if Senator Kennedy, to the effect, if Senator Kennedy had the courage to call Coretta Scott King his daughter-in-law, he was going to throw all his votes behind Senator Kennedy. And a number of other prominent ministers came out. Ralph David Abernathy came out in support of Senator Kennedy. And if you look at the African-American vote in the 60 election, it went up to such a degree that a lot of people think that that's what got Jack Kennedy elected president. And some have said, you know, it was a great political move. But I think it was really an act of hope from my father, a guy who family had fought on both sides of the Civil War, had seen the segregated South, who grew up in Maryland. And I think he thought that if this guy Kennedy got elected president and made some small gesture like that to a prominent African American, and that it might start to heal some of the wounds that were really just 100 years old, that were still very fresh and are still fresh today, obviously, but that might help to heal some of those wounds. So you see these acts of hope throughout his life. The Peace Corps. Creating out of nothing, the idea in the beginning or in the midst of the Cold War, sending young Americans into villages all around the world with little training to live in poverty with the local citizens. Crazy idea. Act of hope. You see it in the creation of Head Start, 1965. I guess I never really contextualized this, but I don't know if any of you saw the movie The Help or read the book. But you know, in 1965, Daddy took money from the federal government and bypassed the political structure, governors and mayors, and gave it to poor people who had formed organizations to community action programs that ran Head Start programs. And in many cases, African Americans were getting money to give their kids a head start so that they entered kindergarten and would then go to college, segregated colleges. I mean, you talk about the audacity of hope. I mean, to give money directly to African Americans in the midst of the racial tensions in the 60s so that their kids could go to colleges that had been segregated forever. Legal services for the poor, giving money and lawyers to poor people who then often turn around and sued the government to get the rights and the access to justice that they had been denied forever. I mean, those are really acts of hope. And I want to just say one thing about these acts of hope, whether they're Head Start or Legal Services or Job Corps. Daddy did it across political aisles, across the political aisle. He was so proud that Governor Romney's dad, Governor Romney of Michigan, was the honorary chair of Job Corps, that Mrs. Reagan was the honorary chair of Head Start, that President Bush, both President Bushes, were such strong supporters of Special Olympics. I don't think he really cared whether you were a Republican or Democrat, whether you were white or black, whether you were a man or a woman. What he was interested in, as corny as it sounds, was, you know, heeding the gospel's call to feed the hungry, to clothe the naked, and to shelter the homeless. So if you're a Republican, great. If you wanted to work on it, same with the Democrats, and I think that's really important. So let me just say a couple last words about love. I mentioned my mom and dad's 56-year relationship. You know, I tell a story in a book about in 1968, my dad was the ambassador to France, and my mother, in 1968, turned the American embassy in Paris, which is probably one of the, you know, cultural centers of the world, into a training facility for people with developmental differences in the late 60s, when most people, including President de Gaulle's daughter, was hidden from public view. Okay, people with developmental differences were not at events like this. They were not working. They were not living on their own. They weren't going to school. And my mom turned the American Embassy into a training ground. You can see a picture in the book of those tires that athletes run through, right in the American Embassy. And I think a lot of people must have thought, or did think, that, you know, my father wasn't kind of the macho guy, that he allowed this crazy woman to bring all of these, you know, retarded people into, or, you know, frankly in those days, retards into the American Embassy, and that my father was weak for not, you know, being a strong male. But in my mind, it was the exact opposite. Here was a woman that, you know, sister had developmental differences, who wanted and felt it in her gut that they ought to have access to athletic opportunities just like her brothers and sisters had had, and that he was going to support that woman regardless of what other people thought of her. I'll tell you couple more stories. My brother Bobby got arrested for smoking pot in 1970, actually in Hyannisport, right? Some of you may remember that. I guess it was on the front page of the paper because I've seen it. It was on the front page of every paper in the country. And Bobby Shriver, Jr., was arrested with Bobby Kennedy, Jr. a couple months after Bobby Kennedy, Sr. had been killed running for president. You had my father thinking of running for governor of Maryland. You had Uncle Teddy thinking of maybe running for president, not sure what he was doing. So when these kids got arrested, it was on the front page. And Bobby tells a story that, you know, he had the long hair, listened to the Rolling Stones, hair was cut that morning, he was arrested. And my father flew in, he was in California, and was told to go visit Dad in his bedroom. And Bobby said it was a really long walk down the hallway. And he said, Dad, he said, look, sit on the bed. He goes, look, you're a good kid. I love you. You have to take responsibility for this, but I love you. Don't listen to what anybody else says. You're a good kid. And that was it. Boom. And I got to tell you, you know, I mentioned I was in politics for 8 years. And, you know, if our daughter got arrested for smoking pot, and I was thinking of running for governor of Maryland, I think there'd be a little more yelling. And be a little more yelling in our house. And I think the point of the story is, you know, that he understood that his kid was at a critical moment in that stage of his life as a 16-year-old, hugely embarrassed. And the kid could go one way or the other at that critical junction. And what was most important for that child was giving him unconditional love. And I think that's a really powerful thing to hear, especially for guys, because, you know, oftentimes to be, you know, a male in America, unfortunately, is to, you know, be the alpha in your family. You've got to be in charge of your family. You have to boss your wife around. You have to yell at your kids, which ultimately is not the way my father handled things. And he gave that unconditional love to Bobby. I'll tell you one more quick story. My daughter Molly, who's now 16, was a lacrosse player when she was, I guess, 11 or 12. And she's wonderful. Not, you know, kind of a crazy athlete, you know, yelling and screaming, kind of like some other members of our family. And one day Molly was out playing lacrosse, and I was watching her. It was a beautiful day. And she was she's an attack. And she was talking to the opposing goalie, gabbing away with her, right? And I'm yelling, "Move, Molly, move." And the ball would come, and, you know, she'd run, scored a couple goals, but she wasn't really moving. So I was yelling, and on the way back, I said, "Molly, honey, what are you doing?" And she said, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, you're not running. You got to move faster." And she said, "Well, the goal," and I said, "You can't talk to the goalie. You got to throw the ball at her head." And she goes, "No, she's really nice. We're going to go to a dance next week." And I was like, "Oh my God," you know, pulling my hair out. So the next week I brought Dad, and he had Alzheimer's. And he was in a wheelchair. It was a beautiful day again. And he didn't know that I was his fourth kid. He didn't know that that was his granddaughter. He knew that we had a, you know, special, you know, different relationship. And, you know, I started yelling again. I mean, just to be clear, I'm not a crazy parent, but I was yelling. And about 15 minutes into it, he said, "Hey, you." And I looked down, and I'm like, oh my God, something's happened. He's, you know, he's got Alzheimer's, something's gone wrong here. And I said, "Yes, Daddy, what?" And he goes, "Did I yell at you like that when you were a kid?" And I went, no, because he didn't, you know. And I think what, again, he was teaching me, and kind of that one moment of insight that he was sharing, is that, you know, you got to love your kid. And if your kid scores a goal, it's great. If your kid doesn't score a goal, it's okay. That really, last time I checked, there's no professional women's lacrosse league. And that what's really important is to have Molly doing the best she can, and to compete, and to have fun with her friends, and that you ought to support your kid in that endeavor. And so often I think that mostly the guys that are yelling on the sidelines are insecure guys that are worried that if their kid isn't the best athlete on the field or in the top 5, that other people will look at them like they failed with their daughter or their son, when in reality, our daughter's doing great. She's lovely, wonderful kid. And ultimately, that's much more important than whether your kid scores 3 goals or is the best lacrosse player, and that you need to love your kid in that kind of a situation. So a couple of weeks after that experience, I was driving Dad over to eat dinner. My brother Timmy had him over a lot at his house, and Jeannie and I had him over at our house a couple times. I was in charge of my father and mother's legal care and financial care when they got older. And my dad had Alzheimer's for 10 years. And I was driving him over to our house, and I can remember right where the light was. It's on 7 Locks and Bradley. And he was, you know, quite lucid at that moment. And I said to him, I don't know why I said it, but I said to him, "You know, Daddy, you're losing your mind. How does it make you feel?" And without missing a beat, he said, "I'm doing the best I can with what God has given me." And, you know, when I wrote that down in this book, I think he was doing the best he could with what God had given him throughout his life, whether it was surviving the Depression, whether it was surviving World War II, whether it was these wonderful moments of starting the Peace Corps, whether it was taking Special Olympics all around the world with my mom, whether it was raising kids, whether it was the man who, you know, planned President Kennedy's funeral. You know, he got the call on Friday afternoon that his brother-in-law had been shot. He was eating lunch with my mom. He had 3 kids under the age of 10. My mom was pregnant with me. And he gets the call from Jackie Kennedy and says, "Can you put together a state funeral for Monday?" And, you know, there's no book on that. He's the first Catholic. And you had leaders from all around the world. What's the mass going to look like? How do you accept President Kennedy back at the White House? He put all that together on really no sleep. And I think he did the best he could at that point with that. In that situation, like he did with Bobby, like he did when he had Alzheimer's, he did the best he could with what God had given him. And I think that's a really important thing for all of us to remember. So you're probably wondering, you know, what faith and hope and love have to do, you know, with you all. I just think it, for me anyways, as a guy with 3 kids trying to figure out how to balance family and friends, how to balance work and community service, trying to do something in my neighborhood and maybe even on a global scale and save the children where I work, how to balance a relationship with God, that this example of this guy who did it all and did it with such joy was why I wrote the book. I honestly never expected it to be a bestseller. I did it for myself because I wanted to figure out, how you tap into that joy. And I think it really was and is his faith. And it was the fact that he got on his knees every day and asked God, asked his best friend for direction, for advice. And whether he was a big shot working for the government or whether he was battling Alzheimer's, he realized that he wasn't God, which is also a pretty powerful thing, particularly in America, because I think at least most of the guys and women I know all think they're God-like and in charge. But really, obviously, that message that I got from my dad about who's in charge was the most, it was a really important one. So I want to thank you very much for inviting me here. I want to tell you, I'm going to tell you one last story. The guy who helped me on the book is a guy who dated a woman. His name was Greg Jordan, and he dated a woman for 5 or 6 years. And after the book was done, he called me up and said, I got engaged. I said, wow, congratulations. What happened? And he goes, I came to feel like your father was a friend of mine. And I just felt like he was asking me to make a commitment to love, to make a commitment to the woman who I loved, and to make that commitment a lifetime one. He just had twins a couple of months ago. And I hope that if you get the book, or even if you don't, that if you think about some of the lessons that he taught me and continues to teach me really today, that you'll get a friend. Like Greg Jordan did, even though my dad was dead physically, he had become a friend with my father 3 years after he died. And I hope you get a new friend in my dad as well. Thank you very much. Father, are you going to resign now, or what are you doing? Oh, it's Monsignor.
It's only 2 more years till retirement.
Okay.
I'll hang in there. If anybody has questions, for those of you who have been here before, you know that we ask you to come up this side aisle rather than cutting across, because we have wires here. And somebody already fell once tonight. I don't want anybody else falling. Please use the mic. You can turn it around if you want to talk to Mr. Shriver, but we need it for the recording, for the website. And remember, if you want to see it again, our webmaster is a little bit under the weather, so it might not be up tonight like she always does, so it'll be up in a few days perhaps.
You mean you can just watch me over and over?
You can just watch it over and over and over.
So if you're having problems going to sleep, just pop it on.
You can make your kids watch it over and over and over.
So you want me to tell you one funny thing while people think if they have any questions?
Sure.
So my daughter says to me after we write the book, Monsignor, that shows you how good a father I am. She goes, oh, Daddy, this is so great. I'm going to write a book about you. And I'm like, oh, honey, that's wonderful. This is Molly. I said, what are you going to call it? And she goes, N-OK, Dad. So I learned a lot of lessons. I'm not really that good at implementing them, but I'm okay, I guess. So
comments, questions?
I had a professor at Holy Cross. Are you coming up in the back? As long as Jimmy Shea doesn't ask any questions, I'm fine here. I had a professor at college who used to, at the end of his lectures, say, questions, comments, or criticisms. So I'll take questions and comments. And if they're constructive criticisms, I'll take those.
We were talking earlier that I came from a large family, but my father and 8 of my siblings all went to Holy Cross.
You didn't tell me that.
I didn't tell you that.
No, I like you now. You're good.
My sister was in the first class that had women
Really?
4 years.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
People would ask me, what did you do? I said, well, I went to a Catholic college. I went to the seminary.
Now I don't like you.
I know you aren't your dad, but maybe you can give us a little insight. I am really concerned that there seems to be an underlying theme in the Muslim world of destroying people who don't choose to be Muslims. And that makes it hard to think about Muslims immigrating and Muslims in our country. And I just wonder if you could give me your perspective or what you think your father's perspective might be as far as this Muslim tendency to kill Christians and everyone else. Thank you.
I think it's a very small segment of the population. I think if you look at Islam, you look at Judaism, you look at Christianity, they're based on love. I think all the great religions are trying to set up processes, trying to help us reach out and reach and touch something that's bigger than ourselves. Call it Yahweh, call it God. I think that it's all trying to connect with something that makes a difference in our lives, and that's God. For my dad, for me, it's Catholicism. It's, as I said, it sounds corny, but it's true. My father's best friend was his relationship with God. His second best, which was pretty close, was the relationship with my mom. I think Islam is based on that. I think the overwhelming majority of Muslims that I've met and I've read and interacted with are all peace-loving. I got driven to the airport at 5:30 this morning by a guy in Washington, D.C., who's a Muslim, smart guy, really great, thoughtful. Put his kid through, went to public school, got a full ride. He's from Ghana, full ride at the University of Chicago. So I think, there's people using religion for centuries to kill other people. And frankly, it's not been solely Islam. So I think the real question is how do we build bridges of understanding? I saw this show that Andrea Mitchell did about Seeds of Peace, trying to get young Jews and Muslims together in New Hampshire, I think it is, and spend some time trying to break down walls of misunderstanding and hate and anger. And I think that's what we really ought to be talking about. I think the guys that are using religion are using it for power and for money. I don't think they really speak on behalf of Islam any more so than, people could say the Crusades and, Catholicism was bad at some point. That wasn't really what Jesus was talking about. At least I don't think it was. I think Jesus talked a lot about love. So it's a butchering of it for their own purposes, which is usually, it's always about money and it's about power. And that's not real religion. Nobody wants to ask a question about Maria? Come on. You have to come you guys have to come all the way up here, Monsignor?
I have to use the mic.
Oh. Why don't you just stand up and say it, and then if I don't like the question, I'll rephrase it, and then...
This is going to be a doozy.
Okay.
You mentioned your dad went to Mass every morning.
Yes.
Okay. For a period of 4 years, I went to Mass Monday through Friday. And I'd like you to guess the name of that school that I attended in Worcester. Because when I was there, it was an absolute requirement.
Yeah.
There was no volunteering. Okay?
Right.
The only time it was voluntary was on Sunday. Now, that is a background. You said you loved Holy Cross, and most graduates did. But could you share with the audience maybe one of your more memorable experiences up there?
Yeah, I think it's,
hopefully a positive one.
No, it was definitely positive. There was a great priest up there, I don't know if you ever ran into him, named Joe LeBrand, Father LeBrand, and he used to run the retreats, and he had actually been a missionary, he's a Jesuit, and he was a missionary in either Iran or Iraq, I can't remember which. And he used to walk around with a cowboy hat on and a shillelagh, and he had the greatest Boston accent. And he used to walk around when the students were, coming back from the library, and he'd go, "To whom much is given, much is demanded." And then he'd whack you right across the shin or the kneecap, and he'd say, "Are you going on retreat?" And he'd be like, "Yeah, Father, I'll go on retreat." And then he'd hound you. And at Holy Cross, there was a pub on campus, and he used to go into the pub and talk to people all night long about going on retreat. I went on retreat my senior year, and it was the best thing I did at Holy Cross. You know, it was 4 or 5 days of silence, led by a couple of Jesuits, a bunch of Jesuits, and it's amazing, at least for me, what happens when your mouth stops and you think and you pray, and they give you readings a couple times a day, and then they send you off. It was in, I think in Narragansett, it was somewhere in Rhode Island, and it was fantastic. Holy Cross didn't have Mass required Monday through Friday when I was there, but I'd say almost everybody I knew went to Sunday Mass at either 10 or 11, I can't remember what time it was, and it was great. I mean, I think it's really powerful. I mean, I loved it. The Jesuits were very much involved in teaching. They teach, you know, classes. They're very active in that school. Father Kuzniewski, I'm still in touch with. He was a history teacher, great guy up there. But Father LeBrand had that, you know, kind of incredible Boston accent and that passion to get you to go on a retreat because he knew the power of prayer. And that was a really wonderful thing to impart on a 20, 21-year-old kid. And I never forgot it. It was great. It was wonderful. Anybody else? Goodness, there's so many people here. No, Jamie, do you want to ask a question? Jamie could write a whole book about growing up with the Shrivers, but that would probably be a really big bestseller. But maybe not.
To show you how much the cross changed over the years, my 2 older brothers, who are now in their early 70s, started up there, and if they were going to leave campus on a weekend, my parents would receive a postcard telling them that they were going to be off campus. That's how strict it was.
Yeah, I don't know if my mother knew that I was on campus most of the time. It's a little different vibe.
Thank you for coming. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.
And ideas.
Thank you all very much. Thank you. Thanks. Thank you very much for being here. Appreciate it. Thank you.